The following program is part one of two parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
I'd like to start with identification of plants because it really is the basis for all weed control, if you will. And I'd like to start with a story of sort of plant identification, and that is that, and actually it gets into management as well. But when the early caveman, well, initially man was nomadic. And I'll use the term man generically here because women were nomadic as well. But they moved from place to place basically for food or weather reasons, and food being the most critical. But if they found a location, of course, where food was common, they frequently would stay there for a short time before moving on. As populations grew, they basically became an agrarian type movement of staying at a single location and trying to grow plants that they liked. And of course, that's how evolution occurred too, you know. When they moved from place to place and they tried all these different plants, if some of them happened to be poisoned from a poisonous plant, that evolved a person that hopefully had somebody that was a little smarter in their family. You don't eat that plant again. So you evolved, and our knowledge of poisonous plants evolved over time as well. So they began to settle down in locations, and then they found out that there really wasn't enough food plants there. So as they came out of their cave and they had to go walk off in a distance to find their food, they got to thinking that, well, it'd be better if I planted a bunch of stuff. I like this one and I don't like that one. So they got a stick or a rock and they beat that one they didn't like to death, and that was the first weed control. That was weed management. It actually worked. And they got a little smarter and eventually decided to put the stick and the rock together, and they made the first hoe. And eventually, of course, they sharpened the rock and then make metal, and then they had a metal hoe, and we still have a metal hoe. So we really haven't progressed very far, have we? We still use a hoe. In fact, you probably have your favorite hoe. I do. And you know, I keep it sharp, keep it clean, keep it in a place that I can find it all the time. Don't leave it out in the weather, you know, things like that. So it's still very much a part of our management practice of using hoes or metal objects to control weeds. And I'll get into that as we talk about control. Well, initially you can actually do all kinds of ways of classifying plants so that you can remember them. You could, like some books do, you could say, well, I'm going to learn everything has yellow flowers, and I can differentiate yellow flowers from white flowers and purple flowers and pink flowers, and therefore I can classify it by the flower color. Now, flower color is not really the greatest way of telling them apart, but flowers are. Now, we use flowers as identifying tool primarily because it's the least plastic, as we call it. In other words, it doesn't change from plant type to plant type. If you have a single species of plant, that flower will virtually be the same throughout wherever you find it. Now, it may be a little bit bigger, maybe a little smaller because of the environment. It may not have as much moisture. You may have more moisture, more nutrients, less nutrients, and so on. But the characteristics are pretty much uniform. So we use the flower as the principal identifying tool, rather than leaf shape or color of the leaf or the roots or anything like that. So flower is by far the best way of trying to identifying plants. Now we can also take another general course identification, and that's say, well, they're broadleaf or they're narrowleaf plants. Now in many cases that works pretty well because most narrowleaf plants are grasses. Now, unfortunately, not all of them are, but there's some characteristics of those narrowleaf plants, for example, such as the veins are parallel in the leaves. and that would then put it in this narrow leaf plant group. Whereas generally the broadleaf plants have what we call netted veins, or more palm-like veins. So they may come out as a midrib and then form veins throughout that broad leaf. So those are two big categories that you can also differentiate. But unfortunately, within the narrowleaf plants, you do have grasses, which is a huge family. But you also have sedges, which often look like grasses, but they have a characteristic of, say, instead of a round stem or a flat stem, which grasses have, they will have a triangular stem. Now, if you have a solid round stem, you may also have what's called, instead of a sedge, a rush, but it still becomes part of this narrowleaf plant, if you will. Now, I'm going to grab a plant over here that's probably a little confusing, or could be. If one were to see this, of course, the first thing you'll say, well, that's a grass. And it is, and therefore it would fit into the narrowleaf plant. But if you don't have any flowers, you have to depend on the leaves of trying to identify it. And there are certain characteristics within the leaf, and I really won't try to teach you this, but probably the most, again, most uniform part of a plant for identification is at the base of each leaf. There are certain little pieces there that will be fairly good characteristics, and you'll find this in most of the text. They'll talk about the collar region of a grass plant. And the collar basically is like a shirt collar or blouse collar, where you have 2 or 3 things there, and this may be a little bitty pieces that look like what's called auricles, and they may have ligules. These are all botanical names that you really are not going to spend a lot of time looking up, but those are the characteristics right there at that collar region. That in many cases you can identify grasses without a flower. Now, flowers are rather small on grasses and makes them somewhat difficult to control or to identify them, but they are really, once you get into grass identification, they're really very easy to separate. Actually, probably more simple to separate grasses than maybe the broadleaves. Now, from what I've talked about so far, would you consider that a broadleaf or a narrowleaf plant? Narrowleaf. And especially if I were to compare that one to this plant right here, which of course that's easy to say that's broadleaf. Well, you'd really have to get down and look at the leaf very closely to look at the veins in the leaf to say that that really isn't a narrowleaf plant, it's a broadleaf plant. Even though it has a, quote, narrow leaf compared to this, it is a broadleaf plant. This happens to be narrow leaf plantain, which again, common name which confuses you. And if you look at the Latin name, the species is lanceolata, lance shape, which gives you the shape of the leaf. But if you look at the veins in the leaf, they're not parallel, although they appear to be, some of the main ones appear to be parallel, but they aren't. And this is a broadleaf as well as this one. This is broadleaf plantain, that's narrowleaf plantain. But so they're both plantains, and they also both happen to be perennial, which I'll get into the perennial and annual a little bit later as well. In fact, if you look at them closely, a hand lens is normally recommended for, say, identifying insects, but a hand lens can also be very beneficial of helping identify plant material. Well, I mentioned perennial. I know all of us know this term. We have annuals and biennials and perennials as ornamental plants. Well, weeds are plants as well, so why shouldn't they have the same life cycle classification of annuals, biennials, and perennials? We do. And they have many of the same characteristics that make an ornamental plant desirable. The perennial can also make the weedy plant undesirable. Excuse me, no. Yeah, thank you. But I'd like to talk about plants. Plants as a sort of as a general area, and sort of think about weeds as being something that we have laid on top of plants. And your weed may be my wildflower, and vice versa. Right? So most common, the weed is a plant out of place. This is sort of the common definition that's used. I've given you an example or two of a plant. A weed is a plant whose virtues have not been discovered as yet, such as, again, milk thistle. Another very good example is what's called Klamath weed. Has anyone heard of Klamath weed? That's a good common name, Klamath weed. Where did it come from? Well, it was named after sort of the Klamath Basin, because that's where it sort of became very popular in California. It was an introduced species that came here without its predators. And it's sort of like the star thistle of today. Years ago, Klamath weed was probably on about 10 million acres of California rangeland, and it poisons livestock. So the livestock people were very concerned about its invasion. They tried to get rid of it, and it became so widespread because it didn't have any of its native predators with it that it covered a lot of the state. And so they introduced a biological control insect to try to reduce its population. Well, it was an absolute amazing success. In fact, it is by far the best example of biological control of weeds that we have. Now, we still have the plant because biological control never eradicates anything. It only keeps it in a low level of control, and it cycles. As the predator builds onto the food source depletes. So you have this cycle of increase in food source and increase in predator, a decrease in food source, a decrease in predator. And they follow each other cycle-wise. And we can see those cycles year after year. But the beetle was so successful that they actually erected a plaque for it. If you go up into Modoc County, there's a little plaque, actually a good-sized plaque up there, for the chrysolina beetle, or the Klamath weed beetle, for its control or reduction of Klamath weed. Now, the other end of the story, and that gets back to this little definition here, has anyone ever heard of, let's see, St. John's wort? Yeah. You know what I'm talking about then. It's the same plant. Klamath weed is St. John's wort. Well, now we want to grow it, right? Well, I got a call not too awfully long ago from Oregon, and this person was saying, can you please help me? I've got this insect that's eating my St. John's wort. I said, yes, probably you do. And I said, it's pretty effective too, and yes, now what do I do about it? So anyway, the plant's virtues had not been found at that point. It was a poisonous plant to livestock, therefore they wanted to get rid of it, if you will. So St. John's wort can be harvested in the wild. That's called Klamath weed. It's exactly the same plant. So things do change. Why do we control weeds? Now, there are many different reasons why we control certain plants as weeds, and that'll go back to my caveman comment. If we're into growing a plant for food production, or for our garden, if you will, we want to reduce competition. Now, all plants are competitive. They competing for nutrients, they compete for water, they compete for sunlight. Basically, they compete for space. So there is competition going on with all plants, and that is true whether it's a plant A and B different species or plant A and B same species. So they are highly competitive. Reducing fire hazard, we all hear about the amount of wildfires we have in California. This is basically a buildup of plant material or fuel, if you will, and therefore periodically it will burn. Now if you follow along the California freeway system, years ago they used to use quite a few herbicides right along the freeway edge to keep the weeds from encroaching actually into blacktop. And so they sprayed that area along the side. Well, by doing so, they actually had a fire barrier. So there's nothing that could burn somebody threw a cigarette or a match out or a spark off the vehicle. It just didn't start a fire. Well, since there's much less of that and we have mowing of the vegetation, dry vegetation right up to the freeway, the numbers of fires along freeways are going up like this at the same time the herbicide quantity is going down like that. So it's interesting that Caltrans doesn't pay for most of those fires. They are taken care of by the community because the fire engine is called from Roseville. It's not called from Sacramento Caltrans station. So Roseville gets to pay for it instead of Caltrans. So we see a whole different dynamic, if you will, from various parts of why we want to control these weeds. The other is basically just safety. If you pulled up to a stop sign and couldn't see the stop sign because weeds are growing in front of it, that's a hazard. Now, I think personally that a hazard is poison oak. I'm horribly sensitive to poison oak. But I know people that have driven from the Bay Area to Placerville in the fall just to see the color of poison oak. It's sort of like a wild foliage. No, people do that. They really do. So to them, it's not a weed at all. It's something to visually view. I mentioned this chickweed seed thing. Often weeds are reservoirs for viruses, also many different other diseases. Insects feed upon them and so on, and other pathogens may actually be on the weed, and then they end up being transferred to crop plants. Now, as a landscape person or our homeowner, we really don't care very much about that because it doesn't influence us much other than it's things that we have to pay for when we go to buy food. So it's not something we have to be worried about in our own landscape. And aesthetics is probably the most reason that homeowners worry about weeds. They just don't look good. They're not thrifty, if you will. So that's what their tendency is. It's not necessarily all these other things as a major concern for, say, a homeowner. What's that native plant? What is that native plant? Poison oak. That's a native plant. And do you realize that the U.S. Department of Agriculture was going to start a biological control program on that, and they were told they couldn't? You cannot do it. It's a native plant.
The spray that works pretty great on it.
The spray does? Yeah, sometimes. That's true. Now, recently I saw a person actually recommend, and I definitely won't do this, but I saw this recommended. You get a 44-horse weed whip type thing that'll actually have a blade on it. And then you get a helmet, safety glasses, and you put this, whatever the cream is, all over you. Wear a loose knit shirt, because otherwise you're going to get hot. Wear loose pants. Steel toe boots, so if you happen to hit yourself with this blade. Chaps. Chaps are leather things you put over your legs so you just happen to hit yourself. And then you go out and do this for 3 years. And then if there's any that comes back after 3 years, you spray it. And that's to get rid of poison oak. Okay, as I mentioned, the first thing there, weeds as competitors. That really is probably one of the primary reasons that we remove certain plants. They are highly competitive, and in many cases, the plants that we consider as weeds are more competitive than the crop plant that we're planting. Now, we can use the characteristic of the crop plant, whether it's a tall growing annual versus a short growing annual, a perennial, and so on. We use those characteristics. However, we do not always have to have as much competition, but basically anytime we have plants, they are competitive. And this is one of the reasons, as a master gardener, I think you frequently will get calls of saying, I want to plant cover crops in my trees or my vines to reduce weeds. Do you see any problem with that comment? I do, because any time that you have a plant, you're competing with that tree. whether it's the cover crop you plant or the weed that happens to be there. The advantage, potentially, of the cover crop is that you can choose the characteristic of the cover crop as to what kind of competition that you might want to allow. So if you have perennial weeds, you might want to reduce the perennial weeds by having an annual cover crop at the time that we don't need moisture, such a winter annual cover crop. Might not be so detrimental to the tree, but it might actually reduce weed populations. So the whole thought is that any plant next to another plant will compete. This is a case of very strong competition. This actually was taken in Davis, but I've seen it many times overseas, where people actually go into a site that may have lots and lots of plants present. This happened to be Bermuda grass, and plant corn. In parts of Africa and parts of South America, or even Central America, you know, they have this type of a plot, if you will, and trying to eke out a few ears of corn out of that from the competition. I mean, this person literally spent days out there trying to keep this Bermuda grass down just so he could get some corn plants. But the competition is severe under those conditions. This is an example also of onion, and if you think about these onions, they have a very upright leaf. So therefore, they're not really capturing a lot of sunlight compared to plants below it, so therefore they're not really very competitive. They're a very poor competitor. Now the plants on the left were not weeded for 6 weeks. And the plants on the right were weeded as soon as weeds started coming up. And so the difference is 6 weeks of weed competition on the left. And so any garden, you can demonstrate that, and it depends upon the weed species, of course, and how many there are, how many weed plants there are, or any other crop plant. You put any tall growing vegetable over onions and they will look like the plants on the left because they just don't compete well. These two trees are the same age. This is a farm advisor down in the Bay Area, and this happened to be in Santa Clara, but the tree in the back had been treated with a herbicide, and the herbicide didn't make the plant grow, by the way. All it did was to keep down the competition. And by removing the competition, it grew in the background compared to the competition in front. This is over a 2-year period. So it can be, it's something you normally don't see unless you have a comparison right by to compare that with. You just don't see the loss that you might have. So, and you don't need to write all this down. This is not going to be on the test. Most of the time we talk about competition, and there are different parts or makeups of competition. There's really 2 terms I wanted to pull out of here. One is an interference, which is roughly competition. And that's the negative effect of a neighboring plant. And this is what we've been talking about when I've talked of competition. The other term that I'd like to bring up is allelopathy. Has anyone heard of that particular term? Well, frequently there are people out there now who are promoting certain types of control or certain plants because they're allelopathic. Well, basically allelopathy is a giving off or degradation product chemical from a plant that will affect other plants. Now, if that's the case, would you think that eucalyptus would be allelopathic? How many plants do you see growing around the base of a big eucalyptus tree? None. They just don't grow, right? So it must be allelopathic, right? Wrong. Competition. The eucalyptus tree has very shallow roots. It also sheds leaves and bark, right? So you're making a mulch, which is reducing sunlight to the soil. It also has very shallow roots, so it's competing for water and nutrients, and it's very efficient at it. So the reason that the plants won't grow around a eucalyptus tree is not from allelopathy, it's from competition or interference. And one of the ways to prove this, of course, is if you take the plant material from a eucalyptus tree and try to grow plants in it. Now, there's a farm advisor down in Ventura that has used several different eucalyptus, fresh, composted, ground, sawdust, makes a wonderful mulch. Some of the best growth he gets in his field plots is with eucalyptus mulch. It's not allelopathic at all, but people are claiming it because they hope, if you will, that it's a non-synthetic pesticide method of controlling weeds. So it's being pushed basically as a non-synthetic pesticide. Now, if you really question them, well, if it's allelopathic, then it must be a pesticide, right? It's affecting plants. Oh, no, 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 it's not a pesticide. It's natural, and therefore, all it is, well, let's just don't talk about it. You know, that's sort of the way they end up. It is a chemical, and if it truly is, and there are some allelopathic compounds. Black walnut has a product called juglone. It's actually been synthesized, horribly expensive, but it does work as an allelopath. There are actually several others now that are being found as well, but they're few and far between. And they're extremely difficult to show the effect in the soil environment. All of the stuff that's being discussed most of the time comes out of a petri dish in a laboratory. And it does work beautifully there, but if you ever get it to the field, most of the time it falls on its face. Yes?
Could you expand on this, the black walnut and juglone? Because we usually get a lot of phone calls on that, and they are concerned about, well, how about the leaves and all that, and we've always thought it was the roots. Could you explain?
Oh, okay. Yeah, the comment on juglone are actually on walnuts. Black walnut has a much higher concentration of juglone than English or Persian. It's not an English walnut, actually it's Persian walnut. But it is lower in concentration, and also pecan, since it's the same group, and it also will have some juglone in it. There seems to be, well, it's two different things. There's different amounts in the roots, stems, and leaves. Actually, in young leaves, there's very little. In old leaves, there's more. We have actually taken leaves from English walnut or Persian walnut, put them under other trees, and if we don't have it at mulch rate, then we can't show the allelopathy from leaves. If you have a mulch rate, in other words, generally a very broad leaf, so you're using 8 dry tons or 7 dry tons of the leaves, then you have a very good mulch. If one were to pull the tree roots and grind them, you should be able to see an allelopathic effect, but generally not from the leaves. Now, another one that seems to work in the same vein is the husks of the walnut. And if you actually pile them and make sort of a syrup out of it, or the leachate from it, that compound, or that group of compounds, will also have an effect on plants. I don't know if that truly answers your question, but it's pretty much relegated the leaves coming out of, well, as an example, if you have a Persian walnut in your front lawn, the leaf actually landing on the grass and shading it would have a greater effect than from the chemical. That maybe be a better way.
I think people are concerned about growing things under a walnut tree or the vicinity of a walnut tree. Worried about the fruits, the roots then coming in contact with the roots of the walnut tree.
Well, there will be some suppression, I think. If you plant anything under a walnut tree that's healthy, you're going to have suppression because you have low light. Often they may be etiolated, or if you will, weak stems because of the lack of light. But the other thing that they might worry about, as an example, and there isn't a need to be worried, would be the uptake of the juglone into, say, a root crop or a vegetable. That should not be a problem, especially a fruit crop. Now, I don't know, and I don't think there's a problem, say, if you were to grow a leafy crop. Most likely it wouldn't grow just because of the lack of shade, or because of the shade. If there's any concern usually of uptake of materials from the soil, it's usually going to be in a leafy crop, because most of these toxic compounds, if you will concentrate in leaf. and not in fruits. That's why when we frequently use a herbicide in many of our tree fruits and nuts and things like that, we can't find any residue that transfers to that fruit. We may see it in the leaf, but we will not find it, even chemical analysis, being transferred to the fruit. So it has a screening process in the plant itself. I don't know we need to spend any time on here other than these are just things that people have sort of proposed that all of these have been allelopathic, and these are many of our weeds. You know, they just say from studies in the laboratory these are all allelopathic, and they really aren't. All of these turf grasses in one study or another have been claimed to be allelopathic, and yet I've worked with fescues for years trying to see if we could figure out if we could use them as a weed control tool. And we can, but it's not due to allelopathy, it's competition. Now there is another thing that I think that is sort of critical, and it comes into weed control competition, and it's what we call a law of constant final yield. And the way we sort of look at this is that if you have a plot of ground, you could call it a flower pot if you like, that soil mass has a potential of growing a certain number of pounds or grams of biomass or fruit or whatever, a yield. And if we take that certain plot of ground and plant 100 tomato plants or 50 tomato plants or 5 tomato plants and take all the other vegetation away, when you harvest it, it will almost be exactly equal for biomass. So the 100 plants will be smaller, shorter, produce less, but there's more of them, but the final yield will be virtually exactly the same as 5 plants. So you're going to get X amount of biomass or whatever off of that flower pot. Now if I throw 20 plants of weeds in there, I'm taking away 20% of the potential yield, or higher, but at least that as a minimum. So this is why when we talk about competition, that this is a wonderful experiment if somebody wants to try it, is to take a certain plant. Tomatoes is a good one to do it, but you can do any of the others. You know, plant certain numbers, reducing numbers, higher numbers, whatever, and give it, say, 6 or 8 weeks, harvest it, and they'll be virtually the same. It comes out really quite nicely. So there is a law of constant yield, and you can raise the total up and down with fertility and irrigation and all those kind of things, but it's still basically the same. Okay, now we can use that same capability for weed management, if you will, by planting certain types of plants. We use ground covers all the time. We use turf grass as competitors. We can use trees as competitors. In fact, often we layer plants. We have trees, shrubs, ground covers. And the primary theory really is two. One is we exclude light from weeds, and two, we compete for the water and nutrients. So we use the competition then as a weed control tool also. So that's very common in our weed management systems and ornamentals. Now, often you hear people talk about eradicating weeds. That is very, very uncommon. We virtually never eradicate weeds. And then the only way to do that is if we have a new invasion of a particular plant, such as what's called caulerpa. I don't know if any of you have heard of caulerpa. If you've been reading about Jacques Cousteau and the algae that's growing in the Mediterranean that's just taking over the Mediterranean, that's caulerpa. We now have caulerpa in California in a very small isolated spot down around Carlsbad, California. They found it early enough that they feel that they can eradicate it so that it does not become spread into other saltwater areas. So they are isolating it, and they're basically throwing everything at it that you can imagine to try to kill that stuff before it actually gets out. So at that point, we can eradicate a weed. But star thistle, you know, everybody says, get rid of star thistle. You couldn't eradicate star thistle if you had to. There's just too much of it. So Our need is to try to reduce populations so that we can grow crops, grow our landscape, and so on. So the weeds are still going to be there, if you will. Now, plant material moves around many ways locally, often by seed or by soil. Soil is what we call a good seed bank. There are many millions of seed actually in soil. And if we bring in clean topsoil, often we bring in weeds as well. Because if they have pieces of Bermuda grass, nutsedge, tubers, all that kind of stuff, it's transported with soil. And then we have all these plants that blow around. There's lots of seeds formed, and these are just examples. Dandelion, 5,000 to 12,000 seeds per plant. This is actually a very small number compared to some. One of the researchers, in fact, at Davis, decided he would find out how many seeds a plant could really produce. So he isolated a plant, put plastic mulch around it, watered it, fertilized it, and this is a barnyard grass plant, which is a very common weed in California. He got 1 million seeds from that one plant. So plants have the capability then of really producing very, very high quantity of propagules, if you will. Now, how do we control weeds? And there are all kinds of management practices that we use, and a lot of this we do not necessarily with the thought of controlling weeds. Prevention, of course, is the best. Just don't allow a plant to invade your area. If we grow very good turf grass, very vigorous, ground covers that are very vigorous, don't allow any light to hit the soil so that weeds can't germinate, annuals can be controlled. So we prevent a lot of things coming in. Don't buy weedy soil, don't buy weedy compost. I have a situation with a flower grower. Does anybody go to Southern California in, say, April and look at the flower fields, as they're called, at Carlsbad, California? It's this huge mass of ranunculus on the east side of the 101 freeway. But he had a beautiful opportunity to bring in some compost to work into his fields because he has sandy soil, like to get some organic matter and so on. So he got this compost, and lo and behold, it has 3 clovers in it. And right now, in fact, we have research going on at his farm, and after a pre-plant fumigation treatment, which he spent $2,000 per acre to do, he hand-weeded the area after planting his ranunculus, and he also spent $1,200 more per acre with one hand weeding just to try to get rid of that clover. The unfortunate thing is the clover has a hard seed, so he'll have it for the next 20 years. Even if he doesn't let it go to seed again. And he can't kill it with fumigation, because the harshest fumigation we have is methylbromide chloropicrin as a fumigant. Pre-plant doesn't kill clover. It actually allows it to grow. So try to prevent that kind of thing from happening. Don't buy kikuyu grass for St. Augustine. Don't buy green kailinga, which is a running sedge, for bluegrass. You know, don't buy a plant from Washington State that's a good buddy of yours and bring quackgrass down. It's a perennial grass plant that's common up there. It's not common in California, but frequently nursery plants are one method, at least, of moving plant material around, good or bad. Physical and mechanical removal, basically that's pulling, hoeing, all those kind of things. We do it all the time. And you know, I like to tell the master gardeners, because when I get calls, people say, you know, I want to control this weed. And they first off say, well, what weed is it? And then second question, well, where is it? And then third question is, why do you want to control it? And fourth question is, well, if you're a gardener, go out there and take care of it without spraying. You know, pull it out, hoe it out, mulch it out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you know. So as a master gardener, however, you're probably going to really get 2 questions when most people call in or bring a piece of plant material in. The first question is, what is it? Usually the second question is, how do I get rid of it? Now, it used to be, how do I spray it out? But I think they've changed that a little bit now as to how do I get rid of it. But those usually are the two primary questions that you might get when people bring in plant material. Mulching has become very, very popular, and it is an extremely good method of weed control for annuals. It is not effective for most perennials. So Judy brought up earlier Bermuda grass control. I don't know if you can get enough mulch on Bermuda grass to kill it, unless you're to put black plastic over it. Now that is a mulch also. But if you put black plastic so that there was no light that could reach that area all summer in the Sacramento Valley, you could kill Bermuda grass. That's very feasible. So mulching will work on some perennials. You couldn't do it with field bindweed, which is another common perennial. Flaming has become more popular. The use of burning propane. Some people would rather burn the fuel to kill plants than to have the fuel used to synthesize a chemical to kill plants. I mean, it's just another way of using chemicals. It's another way of using petrochemicals, if you will. But propane burners are becoming very popular. They can actually have all kinds of problems. One is, of course, you're dealing with high temperature. You can blow the tanks up. I mean, that is feasible. You definitely can create fires if you're using it around dry vegetation, and you can hurt yourself. I mean, it's very feasible. On the other hand, there are contact application, meaning that you will basically kill the green tissue that you touch with the flame. So the thing about flaming is you do not need to stand with the flamer and burn the poor weed into the ground. I mean, it is such a high temperature, you can go over it very quickly, and what you end up doing is you break the cell membrane and the cells fall apart, if you will, and that's the way flaming kills. You don't have to actually burn the plant per se. So basically I compare it, say, to a contact herbicide in the sense that it is controlling the green tissue. We have pre-plant or pre-emergence herbicides, basically before any weeds or plants germinate, and then after the plants germinate would be post-emergence herbicides. So those are, again, methods of management. I'll show you a few examples of some of these. This happened to be soil movement, to show about prevention. In this particular location in a median strip, they planted the ornamentals, and in so doing, they happened to plant yellow nut sedge, which is a perennial sedge. It's a perennial narrow-leaf plant. It forms nutlets underground. They stay dormant for years, or they may have 6 to 8 buds per nutlet, and if you can kill one with Roundup, the others will actually regrow and so on. So they decided, well, they weren't going to spray it. They were just going to come in, dig the soil out, take it somewhere else, and bring in new soil. Really two problems with that. What did they do with that old soil? Somebody got a mess. They probably put it on other parts of the campus. I don't know. This happened to be at Davis. But then they brought new soil back in, replanted it, and guess what? You got it. It just came right back. So by just removing soil, there are a lot of those little nutlets left in the soil, even if they're right up next to the pavement or something. All it takes is 2 or 3 of them, and they're back in business within a short period of time. Now, if we can totally cover the soil with a ground cover, trees, whatever, as I mentioned before, annual plants will basically be controlled. And if that planting is totally filled, then there's no space or niche, if you will, for a plant to actually get started again with most plants. Well, if we look at cultural control, we've been talking about that really with plantings. Turf grass is a beautiful example of a competitive cultural control. Now, a lot of people don't like turf grass because, one, you have to mow it. But it allows, because of the type of plant that it is, as being a monocot or grass plant that has growing points right at or below the soil line, you can mow it frequently, mow the broadleaves off in many cases, controlling them with your mowing or other fertility, irrigation, and all that, and therefore you don't have a weed problem. Most of us, if we put in a good lawn and maintain it for a year weed-free, it's going to pretty much remain weed-free for 10 years, say, with very, very little maintenance. So turf grass can be an extremely good weed control method. We use some of the others. Drip irrigation is actually good as well because we just don't wet the whole surface, and therefore there's weeds that are not going to germinate. So we can actually control weeds by not allowing them to germinate. Or if they do, they dry out before they become established. Now this is sort of the ultimate, high maintenance stuff. We don't have that in our lawns, although certain people I've seen will plant bent grass just like it was a green on a golf course and maintain it as their turf. Now that's high maintenance. I mean, I think to me it's not stupidity on my own part, but I definitely wouldn't do it. I like what I see in turf, but I don't particularly want to maintain it at that high a level. This is a little lower maintenance level, and the reason I'm mentioning this is, again, when you get a call, I think one of the questions that you often have to ask, well, one is, you need to know what it is, where it is it on this baseball field or soccer field? Do you want just total control of all the weeds? You don't want anything out there? Are you willing to have a few out there? Or does it really matter to you? I mean, why do you want it? That's kind of a question we need to ask. There are some people who really don't care what it is as long as it's green. They don't consider many plants as weeds, and that's okay. I mean, it's not my place to tell you what looks good in your yard or in your ballpark or whatever. So we have to at least allow them to sort of tell us what they would like to have as a maintenance area. Now, this is Golden Gate Park, and there are many people who love that site of English daisy as a lawn weed. Lawn grass, it's a broadleaf, but it's pretty good. Now, if you have that on a golf course and you're using white golf balls, that could be a problem. Well, get yellow golf balls, right? Solve that, no big deal. Until you have dandelion, then you get orange golf balls, and so not a problem. This is English daisy. It has become really one of our harder plants to kill along the coast because it spreads by seed and underground propagules. And it's just very difficult to control. There is no cultural control that we know of. People actually dig it out frequently. Some of them are spraying it with one or more herbicides, and they still really can't control it well. So it has become really quite a difficult plant. But well, I've already talked about lawns. Growing vigorous plants will actually help us immensely in just trying to keep other plants from encroaching. To show the example of some of this vigor thing again with certain species, crabgrass is often one of those plants we get calls about for control. And unfortunately, again, identification becomes a problem here. Because, well, as an example, if you got a phone call in January and this individual says, I've got this crabgrass out here in my lawn, and could you tell me how to control it? And now that you know how to identify crabgrass, and you also know that crabgrass is a summer annual, in January they're not going to have crabgrass in their lawn. So you could ask the question, are you sure you have the plant identified correctly, because you should not have crabgrass in Sacramento in January? And they have to come back and say, well, I don't know, it's grass, it's green. Well, can you bring or send a sample in to me? It's probably annual bluegrass, most likely. But on the other hand, we also get the same question, and they say, well, I have this Bermuda grass in January. Do they? That's right, you doubt it, unless they're looking at brown grass. Yeah, and that is feasible. You have this big brown patch out there and everything else is green with annual bluegrass or bluegrass turf, and you have a big brown patch. They might have Bermuda grass, but they probably don't know it. But if you have that same patch in the summer, it's going to be green, and then, of course, no annual blue. So we often get a a question, and we almost have to question them, do they really know what they have? And then what do they want from that also? But by changing mowing height of a turf grass, particularly tall fescue and perennial ryegrass here in the Sacramento area. And by the way, I would not plant Kentucky bluegrass as a turf in Sacramento. Have you had a turf presentation? What did they say? Did anybody recommend Kentucky bluegrass? Good, good. At least we're on the same page. I would not plant Kentucky bluegrass here. Tall fescue is an excellent turf for perennial ryegrass, or if you can tolerate it, Bermuda grass. Shaking your head, no, come on. If you don't mind it turning brown in the summertime and getting it into your flower beds in the summertime, excuse me, turning brown in the wintertime, getting into your flower beds in the summer, I mean, if that isn't a problem, then Bermuda grass does very nicely here. And all it takes is a little cultural, if you've got it, all it takes a little cultural management, like mow your tall fescue at 3/4 of an inch, and Bermuda grass will take over. So how do you control Bermuda grass with tall fescue turf? Bring the mowing height up 3 inches. And people around you say, why don't you go mow your lawn? You need to mow your grass. Because most people will grow at mow at about 2.5 or 2 3/4 inches maximum. But if you have a little patch of Bermuda, dig it out and then raise the mower height on your fescue and compete it out. So you can use the competition. But let's put this in a graph form. This was actually done back in Maryland, but it was done over a 3-year period. The tall bluish bars on the left was the lowest mowing height. And of course the higher numbers are the higher mowing height. So the blue lines is the amount of crabgrass in the area over a 3-year period. And basically what it shows is that over a 3-year period, if you continue to mow the turf short, the crabgrass increases with time because the competition is gone. But if you keep the mowing height high, crabgrass really isn't a problem. And this basically will never reach that point as long as you keep the mowing height up high. So the competition is so good that crabgrass is not a problem. In fact, in this area, I could propose a program to you that you should never have crabgrass. If you have it now, we could not use a herbicide. We can change your grass growing method and the species, and we can get 100% control of crabgrass. We never have to use a herbicide for crabgrass if you'll grow your grass right. Tall fescue, 2.5 to 3 inches mowing. And if you have a lot of crabgrass, I would renovate, go out actually and dry it out, kill it, and plant in the fall a tall fescue, medium dwarf variety, Mustang 3, bonsai. Actually, bonsai is a dwarf, full dwarf, but there are several good medium dwarf tall fescues planted in the fall so that you have a beautiful tight stand in the fall, so when crabgrass germinates next spring, you didn't have a place to go. You can literally control it by that fall planting. Don't plant it in the spring or you'll have crabgrass. So fall planting will have a solid stand there so the crabgrass can't invade. Raise your mowing height, fertilize for the cool season turf, and irrigate for a cool season turf, and you have wonderful control. Now, saying that, we have many pre-emergence herbicides that we can use. They're extremely effective. They're safe to use on turf. It's not that I'm against pre-emergence herbicides, it's just that we can do it another way. And if we don't have to, but it does mean that you have to basically become a gardener. You have to, grow the plants right instead of taking the easy way out, if you will. The other thing that's part of this is we actually clipped tall fescue at our normal clipping height, and then the yellow bars we went and just really scalped it. I mean, took it right down to a 1/2 inch, and we planted crabgrass. I actually planted smooth crabgrass and large crabgrass. We have 2 species in California. The bars on the far left are smooth crabgrass, the ones in the middle are large, and forget the one on the right, I just mixed them. But the orange bar is where I literally took a little chunk of turf out of the area, leaving a bare spot. And that'll give you an idea of how much crabgrass comes into a bare spot, if you will, versus even scalping the turf. So anytime we open the turf, either from, say, a disease problem where it kills the turf, or if we have a dog and the urine kills the turf and we have an open spot, whatever it may be, if you tend to open it up, then some other weed can come in and flourish. It also tells us that smooth crabgrass, that particular species, is more competitive than large crabgrass, which is what we find. In fact, in our landscape, large crabgrass will be in the flower garden. Smooth crabgrass will be in the turf because of the type of competition that each of them have. Okay, broadleaf weed control, we've basically talked about all these. Identify the problem. Are they an annual? Are they a perennial? Summer annual, winter annual. Establish plans, design a strategy, basically design a landscape that's going to compete with invaders. That's really what I'm trying to say. Because we really don't have to make special practices per se. It's just basically doing our normal gardening thing. And if we can encourage that with people who call in that in many cases want to use a herbicide, usually herbicides are used in turf and in many ornamental areas to correct a problem to get us back on the track, if you will. So often we do not, especially don't have to use them every year. And then the last, of course, is what level of control is required. In a golf course green, it would be definitely different than what you would have in, say, a school ground park or something like that. I understand you will have all of this on slides and so on anyway, so we don't have to recopy all of it. The cultural practices and the last part down here of overseeding. I'm a great believer of overseeding. The amount of money that we spend for seed, particularly in turf areas, is actually fairly high. Turf seed isn't cheap. But when you compare it to having to apply a herbicide more than once, seed is pretty cheap. And by overseeding, we often can increase the vigor of an old site and bring that turf back. Do you have a question?
Yeah, question. What's your take on if you leave the clippings on the lawn as far as spraying weeds? What's your experience with that?
Good question as to whether do we spread leaves by leaving the clippings on the lawn. To a great extent, it depends on what you have on the lawn to begin with. If you have a pretty solid turf, there's no reason at all to take them off. In fact, they should be left on. I think this is why we're seeing, so the rejuvenation, if you will, of the recycling mower. So it's not just good to leave the stuff on. Now, if you have an annual bluegrass weed problem, in other words, annual bluegrass is common in turf, if you have weedy turf and leave the clippings on, you frequently will increase the weed population. So in that sense, the really bottom line is let's clean up the turf, get it weed free basically again, leave your clippings on the lawn. I personally often will leave the clippings on the lawn unless I allow it to go a day or two too long, and then I've got too much big clippings, then I use it as compost. But if I'm out there mowing it correctly so that I don't take any more off than that required, a quarter to a third of a leaf, I just leave it on the lawn. It saves your nitrogen. Don't put your nitrogen somewhere else, and so on. Yeah. Now, turf like this, rather difficult to clean up. This is a rugby field after a match and then rainfall. Actually, it was raining during the match. And it made some wonderful pictures, by the way. These college students were just absolutely mud pies. It was wonderful. But, I mean, that's just total turf abuse. And I'm not sure what you can do with this. There's all kinds of, potential, but in fields like this of heavy use, it's basically reseeding, trying to get it to grow, keep them off for a while, but it's going to happen. It's just one of those things that always happens in soccer fields and so on. There are certain spots of fields that people are going to wear out. I mean, that is common. There are certain plants who love certain sort of ecological niches. Some plants like wet areas, others like dry areas. And often we can associate this because if we overwater, we create the problem. You may have a little annual bluegrass and you consistently go out there and water, say, 15 minutes a day in the Sacramento Valley, you're going to increase weed problems. I mean, it's a given. Now, why would this happen? One is it's a favorable climate, but if you think about it a moment and you have a seedling that falls to the soil and you water it, it germinates, and you water it again tomorrow and it continues to grow, and you water it again because you have a very slight amount of moisture there all the time, that weed seedling is going to mature. Now, if in the Sacramento Valley we can use irrigation as a weed control tool, we can irrigate and get the seed to germinate, but then we withhold the water because we have a good deep-rooting turf, maybe for 4 days or 7 days, depending upon the turf. The little weed seedling germinates, it runs out of water, whereas the grass turf roots are well below it, and then the seedling dies. We get rid of that seed bank in the soil, and we don't have a weed problem. So by just controlling when you irrigate and how much, so basically in irrigation we need to sort of fill the soil with water and then allow it to progressively dry down. So infrequent deep irrigations. Now, different soils, of course, dictate as to whether that's easily done. I mean, you can easily do that with sand, but on clays it tends to run off and so on. But by knowing the soil and how you can manage irrigation, that can work as a tool. Now, there are plants that love dry or compacted sites also. Prostrate spurge is one of those. Probably the best known is down there, prostrate knotweed. The reason it got its name as knotweed is basically you can tie it in knots. It has very tough stems, and you can drive cars over it, vehicles, it just loves that compacted area, dry areas. And it doesn't look real good, but it'll survive. And so under those conditions, it is basically a good weed survivor. Bird's foot trefoil and actually several legumes, black medic is also a legume, white clover could be put on here, because they will tolerate lots of dry or droughty conditions. Doesn't necessarily like it, but they will tolerate it. So it allows them then to maintain the planting, if you will, or the weed population in the landscape. And they're found in dry areas. Now, other mechanical methods, and I'll talk about some of these, each of these: mulching, solarization. I tend to put those two together. Anyway, I've talked a little bit about some of them, but I'd like to spend a little time on mulching, and I did prepare a handout for you on mulching, which actually gives you some little better numbers, I think, as well. Most of the time we talk about water loss or evaporation. We definitely prevent that. We do suppress weed germination. They hide growth of perennial weeds. Notice I say that they didn't say that we control perennial weeds with mulching. But they also may harbor certain rodents, insects, slugs, snails, often associated with mulching. But for weed control, if we just look at that aspect, mulching can be very, very advantageous. Now, this happens to be an experiment that we did at Davis several years ago, where I compared different types of mulches. This is actually a chip, which we don't often consider as a mulch per se. It's more used more to hide what's underneath. And what's underneath are some of these landscape fabrics. Now, there's there's sort of a interesting anomaly with terminology when you get to these landscape fabrics. Would you consider this organic? It's about as organic as you could get. It's called polypropylene. What?
The material is polypropylene.
That's right. It's organic. Technically, it is as organic as one can get. It's made up of carbon and hydrogen. That's organic. Okay, so we have a little problem with terminology. Because when I hear organic, it actually kind of riles my blood when I hear organic. Because, you know, coming with a chemistry or science background, I say, well, that is organic because of the makeup of the material. It's a chemical. It's just made in a different way, that's all. And it is a mixture of carbon and hydrogen. Basically, the way some of these are made is that you take molecules and spray them onto a hot rolling bar, and you end up with a landscape fabric. One of the more common ones, this happens to be Typar, which is a spun bonded polypropylene. So that's also polypropylene, a very good organic material. The difference between these landscape fabrics, which are quite a bit newer, if you will, they're not totally new, than the old black plastic, which is not polypropylene, it's polyethylene. That's organic also, right? I'm going to get you convinced that, you know, these things are organic. Even though you don't like the terminology, it's true. But the difference is that these are water and air permeable. So the old black plastic would actually have a layer of free water underneath from condensation. So water would literally come to the black plastic and stay underneath. And one of the reasons it was so bad as far as a landscape material was in that free water, the zoospore stage of different rots, pathogens, could then infect certain plants like Pittosporum, for example, or junipers are very, very sensitive to that particular organism, and they could literally swim in that free water, whereas this does not create a free water underneath it, so you get this air and moisture change. They don't particularly look good on the soil, and that's why we end up using some sort of a plant-derived product, which, how's that for being, some people call organic, but they are, virtually any plant-derived product is now considered organic. But back to identification, when you talk about the life cycle, we further in the weed science area have tried to define, because it gives us some aid in control, we've separated it into what's called summer annual weeds and winter annual weeds. Now we're right at this point concluding the winter annual cycle. And basically that group would germinate in the fall of the year, grow through the winter time or cool period when there's less light, shorter days, cooler period, and therefore that's when they like to grow, and then they die during the spring and summer, as under natural conditions we would lose moisture, the day length becomes longer, more sunshine, and they die. Well, during that period then, we have the second generation, if you will, during the same annual year, and that would be the summer annuals. So often what happens is we get a trade-off from the winter annuals to the summer annuals in the same spot. So it gives us a timeline under, quote, natural conditions, non-irrigated conditions, when most of the plants will germinate in the summer annual or winter annual. And on this the group over here, I have indicated whether the plants are summer annual or winter annual or perennial. Now, as far as the biennial part of the life cycle, we really have very few plants that we consider weeds, at least, as a biennial. Now, a lot of our crop plants are biennial. If you think about lettuce, even onion, these are biennials, even though we treat them as annuals. So as far as if you have to treat them with coolness, if you will, to vernalize them so that they will actually bloom, but under a natural condition, it would actually be a biennial. So in some parts of the state, cheeseweed or malva, which is what in most cases is thought of as a winter annual. This is a very small version, and I apologize because I'm sure you could probably bring one in that's about that tall with leaves about this big around, and you couldn't pull it out of the ground. You'd have to either use dynamite to get it out or a very large shovel, and you would definitely hurt yourself if you tried to pull it out after about the second year. But in a mild climate, this acts as a biennial, or even a weak, as we call it, perennial. So in mild climates, it will live from year to year, but in many conditions, it is a winter annual. Now, Judy held up the poisonous plants. I brought one. I actually like this book. This is on edible plants. And the man who wrote this, James Duke, who used to be with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, probably one of the most interesting little edible plants book. This one and one other gets into sort of the medicinal characteristics or poisonous characteristics as well, because often the medicinal characters of a plant, if you just increase the concentration a little bit, you've got a poison. So very often, as someone has probably told you, the rate or the concentration indicates whether it's safe or not. That goes for pesticides as well. But many of the compounds in plants, well, plants are made up of chemicals, right? Will everybody agree with me on that? Okay, because most people think of plants as something totally unfamiliar to chemicals. So I tell them that if you're eating plants, you're eating poison. It's just a matter of how much you eat of which plant, that's all. It's the only difference. I'm not going to go over all of these plants. Judy made some comment that we might pass some of these around. If you like, take a little bit out and attach it to your collar, because you can have a bouquet from this. It has little spines on it, and so what it does, it's sort of an inverse spine, so that when you when you attach it, well, it still stays. But they have little spines, which is characteristic of the plant. And again, there's a story about this. This is called bedstraw. Bedstraw. That's a common name in California. If you came from England, they would have called it cleavers. Has no similarity at all. However, this came from Europe, and guess why? They brought it in bedding. Bed straw. They actually used it in pillows or in mattresses, or they sometimes also brought it in with livestock bedding, and therefore a common name was derived. But many times, in fact, most of the early invaders, plant invaders, came from the European area because that's where many of our ancestors came from. And then as others of our ancestors came from Africa, South America, Australian continent, and so on, Asia, then all of these invaders have now come in as well, because most of them, the people who have moved around the world, have a certain plant that they like. They're accustomed to it, it's common around them, and they bring it with them. And that's not uncommon at all. Anyway, this is probably the one we're most familiar with as, quote, mustard. And there are many yellow-flowered mustards as well. That one has a white flower, but it's also commonly called popweed. Now, have you ever heard of that name? Again, see, it's another common name. The reason it's called popweed is if you're weeding it and the little what's called silique or seed pod is mature and it's relatively dry, it splits very quickly and expels the seed, or popping the seed out. And if you don't wear glasses, often you'll get them in your eyes as you're leaning down to pull these mature plants. So you want to pull them before the pods become mature. And that usually is occurring about now. So very frequently, it's a winter annual, so therefore it's maturing right now. Well, I was fortunate enough, I guess, to start work in California about the time that this plant was introduced into the state, and came in 1962. I was working in a nursery in Santa Barbara, and it came in from Canadian peat. It was an azalea nursery that used peat moss in their mixture, and they had this big pile of peat that they'd, some of the bags had broken because the plastic had degraded in the sunlight, and therefore this whole pile was a mound of bittercress, lesser seeded bittercress, which came out of Canada. And since then, since it's a nursery weed, guess what? Came all over the state. So we now pretty well find it throughout the whole coastal region, and now it's pretty well establishing also in the central valleys of California. It does not like the desert region, though it is a winter annual. I'm sure if it was introduced into a landscape in the desert and they irrigated, it'd probably survive the winter, but it does not like the summer, so therefore it would die out. But it still would seed, so therefore it would mature and become a potential weed. It definitely would be a local plant. Again, it's interesting that the plant material that you're bringing in is basically from landscaped areas. Now, many of these are not what we would call weeds in agricultural areas. If we were in an area of cropping whereby we cultivated frequently, they would not even be present. Now, and this is an interesting way of, again, identifying this plant. This is what's called a spurge. Now, who identified this one? Anybody want to take the blame or the credit for that? How did you know it was a spurge? I'm sorry?
We have plenty of it.
You have it plenty, but you've got plenty of other things too.
Does it have spots on it?
No, that's a good comment. Actually, you can find a little purpling in the leaves, which is also characteristic of spotted spurge. However, spotted spurge is what we call prostrate, which means, you know, it lies down. This is upright. So this isn't prostrate spurge, or it's not spotted spurge, because they generally have a very small purple spot right in the very small leaf, and it is prostrate. This one is called petty spurge, P-E-T-T-Y. Now, one of the ways you can tell it's spurge is to pinch it and watch it bleed white. It has a latex-like material that comes from the stem, and that is characteristic of the family Euphorbia, or Euphorbiaceae is the family. But it bleeds white, if you will. Now, one characteristic also about this family is if you're sensitive, don't touch it to sensitive skin or you'll have a rash. And many people will find that most of the spurges, in fact, can be fairly good rash formers. And a lot of people are sensitive to the spurges. There are several spurges. This is probably the most common in the winter. It's winter annual. The spotted spurge or prostrate spurge that we mentioned earlier is a summer annual. However, there is another summer annual weak perennial that has become quite widely established, again, primarily through the nursery type situation. It's called creeping spurge. And I don't have an example of it, unfortunately, but it is a summer growing plant. Does anyone want to see this? We can pass that on around as well. There are many characteristics of these plants, and probably one of the largest, well, we have two real large families. One, as I've already mentioned, is the grass family, if you will, now called Poaceae. Poaceae being the genus Poa is what we call the type family. So in the sense that Poa is the characteristic for the family. Poa annua, I think somebody has the small grass right here. A lot of people know this as Poa annua. If you do, you know the Latin name. So it is, Poa is the genus and annua is the species. And it is the sort of type characteristic for the Poaceae family. It is a winter annual. Now, to really confuse you a little bit, and I like to do that periodically, as you'll find, Poa annua is not always annual. We also have a perennial biotype, as they call it, which is perennial. And you usually find this on golf course greens. If you saw the plants side by side, the flower would look very similar, but Poa annua would be an upright growth, like this right here, whereas Poa annua perennial, if you will, is a prostrate growth. And because of the culture of golf course greens, it has become perennial over the years. So, and it's an evolutionary character of that particular species. So that is one huge family. The other is the aster family, or used to be called the sunflower family. This happens to be called pineapple weed. So if you take the flower head and actually squeeze it and smell it, it smells very much like the odor of pineapple. Now, some people might call this chamomile, and it does look very similar to chamomile, but there's about 5 others that also look similar if you only have the leaves. Spurweed being one of them, same family, but in the sort of late spring, you don't want to sit down or put your hand on it because it has a very sharp barb or spur on it, whereas this one is very soft and nice to the touch. There's another one called mayweed, and again, common names don't really mean very much, but it stinks horribly. So you wouldn't want to crush it. If you did, just take a very small sniff, and you'll definitely tell the difference between pineapple weed, which is desirable, and mayweed, which is undesirable. So odor can be used then as a characteristic for identification as well. And let's go ahead and use this as another example. Now, this is a very unique plant. In fact, I just learned yesterday some more about the plant. I'm learning all this all the time. This is called CHIX weed, which is actually chickweed. And chick is C-H-I-C-K, just like the chicken. And probably got its name because chickens and other birds love the seed. And they feed on the seed. They also feed on the leaf, etc. So birds, and probably English sparrow or house finch and so on, they will carry seed, I'm sure, all over everywhere. So it's distributed very widely. Now, many people don't consider this a weed. In fact, in Oregon, they want seed to plant in their orchards as a cover crop. Now, I just learned yesterday, I was in Salt Lake at a meeting, there's a fellow that was saying that the seed of chickweed carries a virus called tobacco rattle virus that's transferred by a nematode that creates in potato corky spot lesions. Now there's a relationship for you. But it's carried in the seed of chickweed. So as an alternate host or alternate plant, if you will, the nematode may feed upon the chickweed. Then if it's feeding on a potato, it transmits the virus, which is a tobacco virus, to the potato. If it molts, however, and nematodes do molt, they actually shed skin just like any other worm, and they molt, and as they molt, they lose their stylus, or their feeding probe, if you will. When they lose the stylus, they also lose infectivity. So they no longer can infect a plant until they feed on another affected plant. If they feed on chickweed, they pick up the virus again and transmit it again to another plant. So it's a real nice relationship, if you will. The other thing of interest, and just recently I met with a person over in animal science, and he's asking me to work with him on weeds because he's very concerned that the invasive plants that we're getting into the United States, and particularly California, is changing the estrogen level of songbirds. And what is happening is that we're basically, in a sense, changing their characteristics. And I said, what characteristic would happen? Well, he said, we're really not sure. And I said, you mean the songbird is squeaking instead of singing, or the female only lays 1 egg instead of 3 eggs, or what's the problem? And he said, well, all of the above. They really don't know, other than that they see that there's a decline in house finches. They think it's potentially due to the estrogen level coming from the weedy species that are coming in from overseas. It's a theory, who knows if that's true or not, but that's what he's interested in working on. A lot of the plants, of course, that we consider weeds are, as I say, weeds to some people and not others. And again, I'd like to use another example of, quote, what many people will call a weed. Way back in history, this is called wild oat. Back in history, the gruel that we heard about in history came from wild oat. They then tamed the wild oat, if you will, through breeding to what's now considered the tame oat, which we get for rolled oats, if you will, or oat bread or whatever. But this is often then a weedy plant in many of the cereal growing regions of the world, because if we want to grow wheat and not oats, this becomes a common invader. And it's found virtually throughout the world as a major weed species. If we're trying to grow wheat in Montana, it is a major, major problem. And it takes only about 1 plant per meter squared, or yard squared, if you would, to decrease yield of wheat by about 10%. So a lot of the food is lost due to the invasion of this particular plant. But wild oat is very easy to identify once you get to this flowering stage, because these are such an unusual looking seed head. There's nothing else like it other than tame oat. Unfortunately, there are a couple of species, but they're not major differences in California, and it's not much of a problem for us to identify them. But this particular plant is a very, very common one. Okay, rather than going through all of this as far as identification, I would like to make a comment, I guess, about identification. Go back to my caveman example. For a long period of time, it really didn't make very much difference to identify a plant. If you only hoe plants for weed control, about the only thing you need to know is it an annual or a perennial. See, most annual plants you can cultivate and control. So weed control wise, we only need to know if they're annual or perennial. And as a seedling of a perennial plant, it is easily controlled just like an annual plant until it becomes what we call perenniated or perennial form. And then up to that time, you can almost treat it as an annual. So at that point, we really didn't need to know a lot about identification other than that growth cycle difference. As soon as we started doing a little more cultural work, or when we became involved in pesticides, at that point it became crucial to identify plant species. And I'll give you some examples when we get to talking about herbicides towards the end of the talk. But there have been many cases where people did not identify the plants that they have, and they would spray something and it didn't work. And of course the first comment was, well, the dumb stuff doesn't work. And it wasn't the chemical fault, it was the fault of the person applying it because they didn't identify the correct species. And this has happened many, many times. So with the introduction of selective herbicides, then identification of plants has become really critical. And it's even true with Roundup. You know, most people say, well, Roundup controls anything. That's not true, it doesn't. And therefore, it is still critical that we identify plants for that reason, if nothing else, just knowing about them as species.
The preceding program was part 1 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu.